Part 4. The sentence. Chapter 18. The sentence, a definition. Good sentences are the sinew of style. They give to prose its forward thrust, its flexibility, its strong and subtle rhythms. The cardinal virtues of such sentences are clarity, emphasis, concision, and variety. How to achieve these qualities will be our major concern in this part. First, however, we must understand, in a brief and rudimentary way, what a sentence is. It is not easy to say. In fact, it is probably impossible to define a sentence to everyone's satisfaction. On the simplest level, it may be described as a word or group of words standing by itself, that is, beginning with a capital letter and ending with a period, question mark, or exclamation point. In speech, the separateness of a sentence is marked by intonation and pauses. And yet an effective sentence involves more than starting with a capital and stopping with a period. The word or words must make sense, expressing an idea or perception or feeling clear enough to stand alone. For example, consider these two sentences. The package arrived. Finally. The first consists of a subject and verb. The second is only a single word, an adverb detached from a verb arrived. The idea might have been expressed in one sentence. The package finally arrived. The package arrived, finally. Finally, the package arrived. But we can imagine a situation in which a speaker or writer, wanting to stress exasperation, feels that finally should be a sentence by itself. As that example indicates, there are sentences which contain subjects and verbs and sentences which do not. The first kind, the package arrived, is grammatically complete and is the conventional form sentences take in composition. The second type of sentence, finally in our example, does not contain a subject and verb, and is called a fragment. Fragments are more common in speech than in writing, but even in formal composition they have their place, which we'll consider in a subsequent chapter. The grammatical sentence. The grammatically complete sentence is independent, contains a subject and a predicate, and is properly constructed. That definition may sound a bit formidable, but it really isn't. Let's briefly consider each of those three criteria. Grammatical independence. Grammatical independence simply means that the words constituting the sentence are not acting as a noun or modifier or verb in connection with any other word or words. For example, Harry was late is independent. Became Harry was late is not. Because turns the words into an adverb more exactly, an adverbial clause. The construction should modify another verb or clause, as in the men were delayed in starting because Harry was late. 1. The fact that because Harry was late is not independent does not mean it cannot serve as a sentence. In the right context, it could effectively stand alone. But it would be a fragment. To take one more case. They failed to agree is a grammatical sentence. That they failed to agree is not. It is a noun clause and could function as the subject of a verb. That they failed to agree was unfortunate. Or as the object of one. We know that they failed to agree. Subject and predicate. The heart of a grammatical sentence is the subject and predicate. In a narrow sense, the subject is the word or words identifying who or what the sentence is about, and the predicate is the verb, expressing something about the subject. In a broader sense, the subject includes the subject words, plus all modifiers, and the predicate includes the verb together with its objects and modifiers. For instance, in The Man Who Lives Next Door decided last week to sell his house, the narrow, or grammatical, subject is man, and the narrow, or grammatical, verb is decided. The broad, or notional, subject is the man who lives next door, and the broad, or notional, predicate is decided last week to sell his house. The verb in a grammatical sentence must be finite, that is, limited with reference to time or person or number. English has several non-finite verb forms called participles and infinitives being, for example, and to be. These can refer to any person or with either number. But by convention these non-finite forms cannot by themselves make a sentence. Thus Harry was late is a grammatical sentence, but Harry being late isn't, because it contains only the participle being instead of a finite form, such as was. Proper construction. Even though a group of words is grammatically independent, and contains a subject and a finite verb, it will not qualify as a grammatical sentence unless it is put together according to the rules. Rules here does not mean regulations arbitrarily laid down by experts. It means how we, all of us, use English. Thus Harry late is not a good sentence. We simply do not arrange these words in that order. Here is one other example of a non-sentence resulting from bad construction. Harry was late, and although he was sorry, and can only combine elements that are grammatically or more subjects of the same verb, for instance. In this case, and joins two unequal constructions, the independent clause Harry was late and the dependent adverbial clause although he was sorry. The construction can be turned into a legitimate grammatical sentence in either of two ways. Harry was late, although he was sorry. Harry was late, and he was sorry. The building blocks. The basic slots of a grammatical sentence, that is, the subject, verb, object, and words, phrases, and dependent clauses, the building blocks of sentences. Phrases and dependent clauses are both functional word groups, two or more words acting collectively in a grammatical function, as a subject, for instance, or direct object or adverb, and so on. Functional word groups are enormously important. They enable us to treat ideas, too complex to be expressed in single words, as though they were, grammatically, only one word. Take these two sentences. I know Susan. I know that you won't like that movie. Susan is the direct object of know. So is that you won't like that movie. For purposes of grammar, the 6-word clause functions like the 1-word proper noun. Being able to use the full range of functional word groups available in English is essential to writing well. Here is a quick summary. Phrases. A phrase is a functional word group that does not contain a subject-finite verb combination, although some phrases do use non-finite verb forms. We can distinguish 5 kinds of phrases: verb, prepositional, participial, gerundive, and infinitive. A verb phrase is a main verb plus any auxiliaries. They have been calling all day. A prepositional phrase consists of a preposition in, of, to, and so on, plus an object, plus often though not invariably, modifiers of the object. 3 people were sitting on the beautiful green lawn. The chief function of prepositional phrases is to modify, either as adjectives or as adverbs. A participial phrase is constructed around a participle, usually in the present running, for example, or past run, participle form. It acts as an adjective. The man running down the street seemed suspicious. Here the participial phrase modifies man. A gerundive phrase also uses the present participle, but in a construction that functions as a noun. In the following example, the gerundive phrase is the subject of the verb phrase can be. Running for political office can be very expensive. An infinitive phrase, finally, is built around one of the infinitives, usually the active present, for example, to run. Infinitive phrases may act either as nouns or as modifiers. In this sentence, the phrase is the direct object of the verb, a nounal function. They want me to go to medical school. Here it is an adjective modifying time. We had plenty of time to get there and back. Clauses. A clause is a functional word group that does contain a subject and a finite verb. There are 2 basic clauses, independent and dependent. An independent clause can stand alone as a sentence. In fact, a simple sentence like "We saw you coming" is an independent clause. But usually the term is reserved for such a construction, when it occurs as part of a larger sentence. The sentence below, for instance, consists of 2 independent clauses. We saw you coming, and we were glad. A dependent clause cannot stand alone as a grammatically complete sentence. It serves as part of a sentence a subject, object, adjective, or adverb. If we were to place "when" before the opening clause in the example above, we would turn it into a dependent adverbial, clause modifying the second clause which remains independent. When we saw you coming we were glad. Dependent clauses may also act as nouns, either as subjects as in the first of the following sentences, or as objects as in the second. Why he went at all is a mystery to me. We knew that she would be pleased. And as adjectives. The point that you're trying to make just isn't very clear. Absolutes. An absolute is something more than a functional word group, but less than a sentence. It is connected by idea, but not through grammar to the rest of the statement in which it occurs. She flew down the stairs, her children tumbling after her. This absolute tells us something about the circumstances attending the lady's rush downstairs, but it doesn't modify anything in the main clause, nor is it an object or a subject. It simply is not a grammatical part of that clause. The term absolute derives from a Latin word meaning free, unrestricted. The basic types of grammatical sentences. Depending on the number and type of clauses they contain, grammatical sentences fall into three patterns: the simple, the compound, and the complex. In addition, there are compound, complex sentences, though they are not truly basic. The simple sentence. Simple sentences consist of one subject-verb nexus. Nexus means a grammatical connection between words, as in the children laughed. Usually a simple sentence has only one subject and one verb, but it may have, and many do, several of each and remain simple, providing that the various subjects and verbs comprise a single connection, as in the sentence, "The children and their parents laughed and were glad," in which the single nexus may be indicated like this. The children laughed. And their parents were glad. The compound sentence. A compound sentence consists of at least two independent subject-verb nexuses. The children laughed, and their parents were glad. Compound sentences often have three independent clauses or even four or five. In theory there is no limit. In practice, however, most compound sentences contain only two clauses. Stringing out a number is likely to make an awkward, rambling sentence. The two or more independent clauses comprising a compound sentence may be united in two ways. One is coordination, connecting clauses by a coordinating conjunction, and hut, for, or, nor, either or, neither nor, not only, but also, both and. The sea was dark and rough, and the wind was strong from the east. The second method of joining clauses is paradoxes, which is simply butting them together. Without a conjunction, conventionally they are punctuated by a semicolon. The sea was dark and rough, the wind was strong from the east. As we shall see later, chapter 19, these two ways of connecting independent clauses are not necessarily interchangeable. In most cases, one will be better than the other. The complex sentence. A complex sentence contains one independent clause, and at least one dependent clause. Here are several examples. Independ. Depend. We saw that you were tired. Depend. Because the day was cloudy, they put off picnic. Depend. I like the people who live next door. In a complex sentence, the independent clause is called the main clause, and the dependent clause, which always functions as a noun or adverb or adjective, is called the subordinate. Of course, a complex sentence may contain a number of subordinate clauses, but it can only have one main clause. This type of sentence is very important in composition, and we shall study it more closely in chapter 19. The compound complex sentence. A compound complex sentence must have at least two independent clauses, and at least one dependent. Independ. Depend. Independ. We thought that we would go, but we decided not to. Summary. 1. A sentence is a group of words, and sometimes a single word, that makes sense standing alone. 2. Some sentences are grammatically complete, others called fragments are not. 3. Grammatical sentences must satisfy three criteria. They must a. Be grammatically independent, have a subject and a finite verb, and c. Be properly constructed. 4. The parts of a sentence are subject, verb, object, and modifier. 5. These parts may be filled by single words, or by functional word groups. 6. Functional word groups act grammatically as though they were one word. They include phrases and dependent clauses. 7. A phrase does not contain a subject-finite-verb combination, though it may have a subject and an infinite verb form, either a participle or an infinitive. 8. There are several kinds of phrases: verb phrases, prepositional, participial, gerundive, and infinitive. 9. Clauses may be independent or dependent. Only dependent clauses act as functional word groups. 10. Dependent clauses are classified according to their grammatical role as noun, adverbial, or adjectival clauses. 11. An absolute is more than a functional word group, but less than a sentence. It is related in idea, but not in grammar, to the rest of the sentence in which it occurs. 12. Grammatical sentences come in three basic types: simple, compound, and complex, plus a combination of the last two, the compound complex sentence. Chapter 19: Sentence Styles. In the last chapter we defined three grammatical sentences: simple, compound, and complex, plus the fragment, which, though not grammatically complete, may still stand as a sentence. From these types derive 7 sentence styles: the segregating sentence, the freight train sentence, the cumulative, parallel, balanced, subordinating, and once again the fragment. We shall review them in this chapter. We need to be clear at the outset about 2 points. First, none of these styles is inherently better or worse than the others. Each is suited to some effects, ill-adapted to others. Second, the styles are not mutually exclusive. In fact, a skillful calls upon all of them. The segregating style. At its purest, the segregating sentence is grammatically simple, expressing a single idea. Point 1. A segregating style consists of a series of such sentences. In practice, the style is rarely confined to technically simple, one-idea statements. 1. Idea is a slippery word. Here it means simply one subject plus one predication about that subject. The night was dark expresses a single idea. Most sentences consist of several. The night was dark, and it was lonely. Or, with the two predications more closely connected, the night was dark and lonely. That would be monotonous. Instead, a segregating style consists of relatively short, uncomplicated sentences, even though some of them may not be simple in the grammatical sense. Here, for example, a critic is describing how a particular novelist works. He writes, at most, 750 words a day. He writes and rewrites. He polishes and repolishes. He works in solitude. He works with agony. He works with sweat. And that is the only way to work at all. Beverly Nichols. As this passage shows, a segregating style can be very effective. Short sentences are strong and repetitive, qualities exactly suited to Nichols's purpose. He wants to stress that writing often usually is monotonous work. Such fit between sentence style and purpose is important to good writing. The same general point may be put in any of various ways, but no two of the ways will be the same, and only one will be exactly what you want to say. Segregating sentences are especially useful in descriptive and narrative writing. They analyze a complicated perception or action into its parts and arrange these in a significant order. In the following passage W. Somerset Maugham describes the Chinese criminal being led to his place of execution. In colonial times, the British vice-consul had to be present when the victim of the crime was English. The judge gave order, and the vice-consul rose and walked to the gateway, where their chairs awaited them. Here stood the criminal with his guard. Notwithstanding his tied hands, he smoked a cigarette. A squad of little soldiers had been sheltering themselves under the overhanging roof, and on the appearance of the judge, the officer in charge made them form up. The judge and the vice-consul settled themselves in their chairs. The officer gave an order, and the squad stepped out. A couple of yards behind them walked the criminal. Then came the judge in his chair, and the vice-consul. This is a fine example of a segregating style. The sentences are short and uncomplicated, even though three of them are not simple, and none treats only a single idea. They break the scene into a series of tableaus, each rendered without comment. The effect is to distance us from the action, yet the technique is not that of a callous observer, but of an artist willing to let the event speak for itself. Like all effective styles, Maugham deepens meaning, shocking us into seeing that in the society he is describing life and death do not matter very much. The segregating style, then, can be effective in description and narration. It is less useful in exposition, where you must combine ideas in subtle gradations of logic and importance. These subtleties cannot be conveyed by a series of short, independent statements, which treat all ideas as equally important. Individually used, however, segregating sentences are valuable in exposition, especially set beside longer statements, where they will seem strong and clear. Before Election Day Huey Long predicted he would win if rain didn't keep the mud farmers away from the polls. It rained. Harding Carter. The first premise of the college elective system is that the subjects are of approximately equal importance. Well, they are not. Brand Blanchard. Short sentences like these are emphatic and create variety. More examples will be seen in chapters 21 and 23, where we discuss emphasis and variety. Every writer should be able to handle the short sentence to stress particular ideas and, when the occasion warrants, to compose brief passages in a segregating style. On the whole, however, the style is too limited for general use in exposition. In unskilled hands it soon begins to sound like a third-grade reader. Dick has a dog. The dog's name is Spot. Spot is a friendly dog. For practice. In a brief paragraph of about 100 words, describe a football game or a party. Use a segregating style to analyze the scene or action. The freight train style. Several kinds of sentences do what the segregating style does not do, that is, combine ideas. The simplest of these is the freight train style, so called because it couples short, independent clauses to make longer sequential statements. It is a development of the compound sentence, see page 116, and has an old and honored history. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Matthew 7:27. The freight train sentence has several virtues. It is useful when you wish to link a series of events, ideas, impressions, feelings, or perceptions as immediately as possible, without judging their relative value or imposing a logical structure upon them. Children often experience reality in this immediate, accepting way, and authors writing for children, or trying to suggest a childlike vision, may employ the style. And I'll look out for you, and you'll sing out, as soon as you see me. And we'll go down the street arm in arm, and into all the shops, and then I'll choose my house, and you'll choose your house, and we'll live there like princes and good fellows. Kenneth Grahame. Even in writing that expresses more adult attitudes, the same desire to convey mental experience directly may lead a writer to select the style. In the following passage from Ernest Hemingway's novel, A Farewell to Arms, the hero forgets the dull routine of army life by fantasizing adventure with the heroine. Maybe she would pretend that I was her boy that was killed, and we would go in the front door of a small hotel, and the porter would take off his cap, and I would stop at the concierge's desk and ask for the key, and she would stand by the elevator, and then we would get in the elevator, and it would go up very slowly, clicking at all the floors, and then our floor, and the boy would open the door and stand there, and she would step out and would step out, and we would walk down the hall, and I would put the key in the door and open it and go in, and then take down the telephone and ask them to send a bottle of Capri Bianca in a silver bucket full of ice, and you would hear the ice against the pail coming down the corridor, and the boy would knock, and I would say, "Leave it outside the door, please." Both Graham and Hemingway use the freight train sentence to describe an experience taking place within the mind. The style suggests the continuous flow of dreaming, for we fantasize in a stream of loosely connected feelings, and ideas and images, not in neatly packaged sentences, of intricately related clauses and phrases tied together by if, but, yet, therefore, consequently, on the other hand. Indeed, we sometimes fantasize not in words at all but in imagined perceptions, as Hemingway implies, and you would hear the ice against the pail. Hemingway also goes further than Graham in imitating the mental state of fantasy. His one sentence is much longer, and its flow unimpeded by punctuation. This technique is a variety of what is called stream of consciousness, a way of writing that suggests a mind feeling, dreaming, thinking in a loose associational manner. Multiple coordination and paradoxes. The Graham, Hemingway, and biblical examples all use multiple coordination, linking clauses by coordinating conjunctions in these cases, as in most, by using the word and. Instead of being coordinated, however, independent clauses can be butted together without conjunctions, in which case they are conventionally punctuated by semicolons, though sometimes commas are clear enough. This is called paradoxes. Although either multiple coordination or paradoxes is possible in a freight train sentence, they are not exact equivalents. Broadly speaking, the first is called for when the ideas or feelings or perceptions are changing, and when the writer desires a quick and fluid movement from clause to clause. These conditions are true of the three examples we have just seen, as they are of the following relatively short sentence by Hemingway. It was a hot day, and the sky was bright, and the road was white and dusty. There is movement here, involving both the seen and the sense, by which we perceive it. We feel the heat, see the sky, lower our eyes to gaze down the road. The sentence style directs our senses much as a camera directs them in guiding us from one perception to another, yet creating a continuous experience. The freight train style, then, can analyze experience much like a series of segregating sentences. But it brings the parts more closely together, and when it uses multiple coordination, it achieves a high degree of fluidity. On the other hand, fluidity is not always desirable. Ideas or perceptions may be repetitive, with little change and nothing to flow together. Then paradoxes is preferable to multiple coordination. In the following example, Virginia, summarizing a diary of an 18th-century Englishman visiting France, uses a freight train style to mark his insularity. This is what he writes about, and, of course, about the habits of the natives. The habits of the natives are disgusting. The women hawk on the floor, the forks are dirty, the trees are poor, the pont is not a patch on London Bridge, the cows are skinny, morals are licentious, polish is good, cabbages cost so much. Bread is made of coarse flour. Each detail is another instance of the same underlying insensitivity. By hooking her clauses with semicolons in one case with a comma, Woolf stresses the dull, unyielding vision of the diarist. Along with its advantages, the freight train sentence has limitations. Like the segregating style, it does not handle ideas very subtly. The freight train sentence implies that the thoughts it links together with grammatical equality are equally significant. But usually ideas are not of the same order of importance, some are major, others secondary. Moreover, this type of construction cannot show very precise logical relationships of cause and effect, condition, concession, and so on. It joins ideas only with such general conjunctions as and, but, or, nor, or even less exactly with semicolons and commas. The triadic sentence. A second deficiency of the freight train sentence is that it lacks a clear shape. Being open-ended, it has no necessary stopping place. One could go on, and on adding clauses. As a way of providing it with a clearer structural principle, the freight train sentence is sometimes composed in 3 units and is called a triad too. Her showmanship was superb, her timing sensational, her dramatic instinct uncanny. Robert Coughlin, business executives, economists, and the public alike knew little of the industrial system they were operating. They were unable to diagnose the malady. They were unaware of the great forces operating beneath the surface. Thurman Arnold. 2. These sentences are also called tricolons. Loosely, colon designated in ancient Greek rhetoric an independent clause that was part of a longer sentence. A tricolon is a sentence of 3 such clauses. Often, as in these examples, the 3 clauses are paratactic rather than coordinated because the triadic sentence tends to be repetitive. But it can use conjunctions when shifts in subject occur. Then the first star came out and the great day was over, and in the vestibule I saw my grandmother saluted by her sons who wished her a happy holiday. In Lewison's sentence the final clause is substantially longer than the 2 that precede it. Movement to a longer, more complicated final construction is a refinement of the triadic sentence. The canisters were almost out of reach. I made a motion to aid her. She turned upon me as a miser might turn if anyone attempted to assist him in counting his money. Emily Brant. Occasionally the shift may work in the opposite direction, from long to short. Calvin Coolidge believed that the least government was the best government. He aspired to become the least president the country ever had. He attained his desire. Irving Stone. The cumulative sentence. Most commonly a cumulative sentence consists of an initial independent clause followed by a number of subordinate constructions, which accumulate details about the person, place, event, or idea. Though the elements that come after the main clause are technically subordinate, they carry the main load of the sentence and are fully as important. Cumulative sentences appear most often in description. The writer begins with a general picture, like an artist's charcoal sketch, then fills in the details. A creek ran through the meadow, winding and turning. clear water running between steep banks of black earth, with shallow places where you build a dam. Marturer. 7000 Main Street looks itself like a faded movie exterior, a pastel building with chipped arty modern detailing, the windows now either boarded up or paned with chicken wire glass and, at the entrance, among the dusty oleander, a rubber mat that reads "Welcome". Joan Didion. Cumulative sentences are also useful in character sketches. She and Morrow Lindbergh was then 21, a year out of Smith College, a shy, quiet girl with a fine mind and a small, but pure and valuable gift for putting her thoughts and fancies about the earth, sky, and sea on paper. John Lodner. Though less often used in narration, the cumulative sentence can also handle a series of events, as in this account of an English military expedition into France in 1359. The unwieldy provision carts, draft horses, and heavily armed knights kept the advance down to 9 miles a day, the huge horde moving in 3 parallel columns, cutting broad highways of litter and devastation through an already abandoned countryside, many of the adventurers now traveling on foot, having sold their horses for bread or having slaughtered them for meat. John Gardner. Like the freight train style, the cumulative has the problem of being open-ended, without a natural stopping place. But the deficiency may be made good by artful construction. In the following example, the writer, describing a photograph of his parents, opens with the clause "when they sat for a photograph together," follows this with accumulated details, and ends by assessing the meaning of the picture. When they sat for a photograph together, 2 neat slim bodies, the girl unsmiling and her eyes astare, elbows and knees tight, hands clenched in her lap, immaculate to the throat in lacy white, and the young man with grin and straw hat both aslant, jaunty on the bench arm, one leg crossed, natty in his suit and tie complete with stick pin, his arm around her with fingers outspread tross, but of a nation's lower middle class coming out of its cocoon. William Gibson. What happens in that sentence is that the accumulation is gathered between dashes, and intrudes into the middle of the main sentence. When they sat for a photograph together, it was a portrait not only of contrasts, but of a nation's lower middle class coming out of its cocoon. that sentence becomes a frame enclosing the details, a pattern nicely suited to what the sentence is about. Finally, there is another variety of the cumulative sentence, in which the order is reversed. The accumulated details precede the main clause instead of following it. In the following example, a novelist, discussing her art, begins by listing the essentials of a story. Conflicts and rivalries and their resolutions, pride and its fate, estrangement and reconciliation, revenge or forgiveness, quests and searches rewarded or unrewarded, abidingness versus change, love and its proof. These are among the constants, the themes of the story. Elizabeth Bowen. Notice how Bowen uses these to sum up all the preceding nouns, and to act as the subject of the sentence. These, this, that, those, and such are other pronouns, which may be used in this way. For practice, describe one of your typical days, first in 5 or 6 segregating sentences, then in 2 freight train sentences, and finally in 1 long cumulative sentence. Keep to the same details and order in each rendering. The parallel style. Parallelism means that 2 or more words or constructions stand in an identical grammatical relationship to the same thing. In Jack and Jill went up the hill, subject, Jack and Jill, are parallel because both relate to the verb went. In the following sentence, the italicized clauses are parallel, both modifying the verb will come. We will come when we are ready, and when we choose. Parallelism occurs in all types of sentences as a way of organizing minor constructions. When major ideas are involved, we speak of a parallel style, as in this sentence, where 3 parallel objects follow the preposition in. In its energy, its lyrics, its advocacy of frustrated joys, rock is one long symphony of protest. Time magazine. And here, 3 infinitive phrases modifying the word campaign. The Department of Justice began a vigorous campaign to break up the corporate empires, to restore the free and open market, and to plant the feet of the industry firmly on the road to competition. Thurman Arnold. Parallel constructions are subject to a strict rule of style, they must be in the same grammatical form. Consider this opening of a sentence by the 18th-century political writer Edmund Burke. To complain of the age we live in, to murmur at the present powers, possessors of power, to lament the past, to conceive extravagant hopes of the future, are the common dispositions of the greatest part of mankind. According to the rule, the four subjects of the verb must be in the same grammatical form, and Burke has made them all infinitives. They could have been gerunds complaining, murmuring, lamenting, conceiving, or nouns complaints, murmurs, laments, conceptions. But in any case, the point is that they must all be the same. To combine different forms would violate the rule. For example, mixing an infinitive with a gerund to complain of the age we live in, murmuring against the present possessors of power. Such awkward mixtures are called shifted constructions and are regarded as a serious breach of style, sloppy and often ambiguous. Extended parallelism is not a hallmark of modern writing, as it was in the 18th century, when the parallel style was predominant in formal prose. On the other hand, it is foolish and unseeing to dismiss parallel sentences as out of date. They are still useful, and by no means uncommon. We must somehow take a wider view, look at the whole landscape, really see it, and describe what's going on out there. Annie Dillard. The professor shuffled into the room, dumped his notes onto the desk, and began his usual dull lecture. College student. Advantages of parallelism. Parallel sentences have several advantages. First, they are impressive and pleasing to hear, elaborate yet rhythmic and ordered, following a master plan with a place for everything, and everything in its place. Second, parallelism is economical, using one element of a sentence to serve 3 or 4 others. Piling up several verbs after a single subject is probably the most common parallel pattern, as in the 2 examples just above. Paralleling verbs is particularly effective when describing a process or event. The sequence of the verbs analyzes the event and establishes its progress, and the concentration on verbs, without the recurrent intervention of the subject, focuses the sentence on action. Here is an example, a description of prairie dogs, written by the American historian Francis Parkman. As the danger drew near, they would wheel about, toss their heads in the air, and dive in a twinkling into their burrows. And another, an account of an invasion of Italy in 1494 by Charles VIII of France. Charles borrowed his way through Savoy, disappeared into the Alps, and emerged, early in September, at Asti, where his ally met him, and escorted him to the suburbs. Ralph Ruder. A third advantage of parallelism is its capacity to enrich meaning by emphasizing or revealing subtle connections between words. For instance, in the example by Ruder, the parallelism hints at the harebrained nature of Charles's expedition. Similarly, Bernard Shaw, writing about Joan of Arc, insinuates a sardonic view of humanity below the surface of this prosaic summary of Joan's life. Joan of Arc, a village girl from the Vosges, was born about 1412, burnt for heresy, witchcraft, and sorcery in 1431, rehabilitated after a fashion in 1456, designated venerable in 1904, declared blessed in 1908, and finally canonized in 1920. Of course, Shaw's irony is carried essentially by the words themselves, but the rapid parallel progression of the verbs enables us to see more easily the wicked folly, of which human beings are capable, destroying a woman whom later they would deem saintly. The meaning reinforced by a parallel style does not have to be ironic. It can have any emotional or intellectual coloring. In the first of the following examples, we can hear a sly amusement, in the second, anger, and in the third, eloquence. She laid 2 fingers on my shoulder, cast another look into my face, under her candle, turned the key in the lock, gently thrust me beyond the door, shut it, and left me to my own devices. Walter de la Mare. He George III has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. Thomas Jefferson. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and success of liberty. John F. Kennedy. Limitations of parallelism. The parallel style handles ideas better than do the segregating or freight train sentences. However, it suits only ideas that are logically parallel, several effects of the same cause, for in stance, or 3 or 4 conditions, of a single effect. When writers try to force parallelism onto ideas that are not logically parallel, they obscure rather than clarify meaning. A second disadvantage of the parallel style is that it seems a bit formal for modern taste. And a third is that parallelism can be wordy rather than economical if Twitters allow the style to dominate them, padding out ideas to make a parallel sentence, instead of making a parallel sentence to organize ideas. Yet despite these limitations, parallelism remains an important resource of sentence style, one which many people neglect. It is a most effective way of ordering perceptions or ideas or feelings, of shaping a sentence, and of attaining economy and emphasis. For practice, following the pattern of the sentence by Edmund Burke, page 126, construct parallel sentences on these topics, or any others that you may prefer. Duties of a policeman or other official. Complaints about a job. Mistakes you make in writing. The balanced sentence. A balanced sentence consists of 2 parts, roughly equivalent in both length and significance and divided by a pause. In a few moments everything grew black, and the rain poured down like a cataract. Francis Parkinen. Balanced elements may repeat the same idea, show cause and effect, precedence and subsequence, or any of other various relationships. Often balanced sentences develop a contrast. When the contrast is sharply pointed, it is called an antithesis. While balance can involve any kind of clause or phrase, it is most common with independent clauses, as in the example above, or in these. Visit either you like, they're both mad. Lewis Carroll. Children played about her, and she sang as she worked. Rupert Brooke. These examples are compound sentences. Not all compound sentences, however, are balanced, nor are all balanced sentences compound. Balance requires simply that a sentence divides into roughly equal halves on either side of a central pause. This may occur even in a sentence that is not technically compound. They read hardly at all, preferring to listen. George Gissing. Gissing's sentence is grammatically simple, the first half being the main clause, and the second a participial phrase. Even so, it is balanced since the halves are about the same length, each has 6 syllables, and equally important. Point 1. The examples thus far looked at exhibit elementary balance between 2 units/. That pattern, however, may be varied in many ways. Sometimes one half is split again / or /, sometimes the half is split into 3 / or /. Both halves may be broken into 2 / and so on. Here are a few examples. For being logical, they strictly separate poetry from prose, and as in prose, they are strictly prosaic, so in poetry, they are purely poetical. G.K. Chesterton. But called by whatever name, it is a most fruitful region, kind to the native, interesting to the visitor. Thomas Carlyle. I stood like one thunderstruck, or as if I had seen an apparition. I listened, I looked round me, but I could hear nothing, nor see anything. Daniel Defoe. 1. Not everyone would agree to call such sentences balanced, arguing that balanced constructions must be of the same grammatical order, and therefore that a balanced sentence requires that its halves be independent clauses. However, to the degree that we hear a sentence as consisting of 2 parts more or less equal in length and importance, it is balanced. The balance is more exact when the parts are independent clauses cut to the same pattern. Parallelism and balance. The difference between parallelism and balance is that in the former the elements involved must stand in an identical grammatical relationship to the same word or construction. Balanced words or constructions, however, do not have to be parallel, though they can be. Thus in the sentence above by Defoe the 6 clauses are separate and independent, not related to anything. But parallelism and balance often go hand in hand, and nothing prevents the same constructions from being both parallel and balanced, if they are performing an identical grammatical function, are in the same form, and roughly equal in length. Here are two examples. As for me, I frankly cleave to the Greeks and not to the Indians, and I aspire to be a rational animal rather than a pure spirit. George Santayana. The sentence balances two coordinated clauses of similar structure and length. Within the first clause, the prepositional phrases to the Greeks and not to the Indians are parallel and antithetical. In the second clause, a rational animal rather than a pure spirit is a parallel construction, and balance in this case antithesis is provided by playing rational animal against pure spirit. Most people, of course, made no distinction between a communist who believed in nothing but government and such philosophical anarchists as Vanzetti who believed in no government at all. Phil Strong. A communist and such philosophical anarchists as Vanzetti are parallel objects of between, though the second is too much longer than the first to constitute a balance. However, balance does occur in the two who clauses, though these are not parallel because they modify different nouns. The advantages of balance. Balance construction has several virtues. It is pleasing to our eyes and ears, and gives shape to the sentence, one of the essentials of good writing. It is memorable. And by playing key terms against each other, it opens up their implications. For example, the following sentence by Charles Dickens makes us consider the plight of those who lack the cash to turn their ideas to account. Talent. Mr. Micawber has capital, Mr. Micawber has not. Anthony Hope implies a skeptical assessment of politicians and bureaucrats. Ability we don't expect in a government office, but honesty one might hope for. And here the movie critic Pauline Kael comments on the film Love Story. In itself, a love idyll like this may seem harmless, but it won't be by itself very long. Kael's complaint is that schlock films, if they are popular, usher in a host of even worse imitations. Notice how the sentence swings and advances on the phrases in itself and by itself. Beyond highlighting specific words and ideas, balance has a deeper significance. It expresses a way of looking at the world, just as freight train or cumulative sentences express their own angles of vision. Implicit in the balanced style is a sense of objectivity, control, and proportion. In the following passage about Lord Chesterfield, the critic F. L. Lucas reinforces his argument by the reasonableness of his balanced sentences. The very style seems to confirm the fairness and lack of dogmatism suggested by such phrases as seem to me, and I think. In fine, there are things about Chesterfield that seem to me rather repellent, things that it is an offence in critics to defend. He is typical of one side of the 18th century, of what still seems to many its most typical side. But it does not seem to me the really good side of that century, and Chesterfield remains, I think, less an example of things to pursue in life than of things to avoid. Because the balanced style keeps a distance between writer and subject, it works well for irony and comedy. For instance, the novelist Anthony Trollope implies humorous disapproval of a domineering female character in this way. It is not my intention to breathe a word against Mrs. Proudie, but still cannot think that with all her virtues, she adds much to her husband's happiness. The balance suggests the objectivity of the author and increases the credibility of his criticism, while at the same time, the second clause comically reveals him indulging in the very gossip he forswears in the first. Comic, too, is the effect of this sentence from the autobiography of Edward Gibbon, the historian of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, which describes an unhappy love affair of his youth, broken off at his father's insistence. After a painful struggle I yielded to my fate, I sighed as a lover, I obeyed as a son, my wound was insensibly healed by time, absence, and the habits of a new life. Writing from the calmer waters of age, when the tempests of 20 seem less catastrophic, Gibbon is smiling. The very parallelism and balance of this triadic sentence, as formal as a minuet, are a comment on the passions of youth. Balance and parallelism do not communicate meaning by themselves. The primary units of meaning, of course, are words. But balanced and parallel constructions do reinforce and enrich meaning. Or, to be more exact, certain kinds of meaning. Not every sentence can be cast in this mold, or should be. Like every style, parallelism and balance have limitations as well as potentialities. Their very sanity, reasonableness, and control make them unsuitable for conveying the immediacy of raw experience, or the intensity of strong emotion. Moreover, their formality is likely to seem too elaborate to modern readers, a less natural way of writing than the segregating style or the freight train or cumulative sentences. However, we ought not to equate formality with artificiality or to think naturalness the only ideal. All well-constructed sentences result from even those perhaps especially those like Hemingway's that create the illusion of naturalness. Remember, too, that natural is a tricky word. To men and women of the 18th century, parallelism and balance reflected nature, which they understood as a vast but comprehensible structure of ordered parts. Perhaps the best lesson a modern writer can learn from the parallel and balance styles is the necessity of giving shape to what he or she thinks and feels. The shape congenial to the 18th century seems unnatural to us. But while we no longer write like Thomas Jefferson or Samuel Johnson, we can still use parallelism and balance as ways of organizing some aspects of experience and knowledge, and as means of attaining economy, emphasis, and variety in our sentences. For practice, the following sentences all exhibit balanced construction. Some exhibit a simple 1-to-1 balance, others are more complicated. Identify the general pattern of each, whether slash, 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 and so on. I was enjoying the privilege of studying at the world's finest universities. Negroes at home were revolting against their miserable condition. Stanley Sanders. As for me, I am no more yours, nor you mine. Death hath cut us asunder, and God hath divided me from the world and you from me. Sir Walter Raleigh. For aristocrats and adventurers France meant big money, for most Englishmen it came to seem a costly extravagance. Geoffrey Hindley. Then she shrieked shrilly, and fell down in a swoon, and then women bare her into her chamber, and there she made overmuch sorrow. Sir Thomas Malory. Heaven had now declared itself in favour of France, and had laid bare its outstretched arm to take vengeance on her invaders. David Hume. The more we saw in the Irishman a sort of warm and weak fidelity, the more he regarded us with a sort of icy anger. G. K. Chesterton. Building ceases, births diminish, deaths multiply, the nights lengthen, and days grow shorter. Maurice Maeterlinck. In a few moments everything grew black, and the rain poured down like a cataract. Francis Parkmark. He could not keep the masses from calling him Lindy, but he convinced them that he was not the Lindy type. John Ladner. In literature there is no such thing as pure thought. In literature, thought is always the handmaid of emotion. J. Middleton Murray. Choosing different subjects from those in the text, compose 5 balanced sentences modelled upon examples in the preceding question. The subordinating style. The sentence styles we have looked at thus far segregating, freight train, cumulative, parallel, and balance are similar in one essential: all treat their constituent ideas as more or less equally important. In much composition, however, it is necessary to show degrees of significance. This calls for a different principle of structure: subordination. Subordination means focusing on one idea expressed in the main clause, and arranging points of lesser importance around it, in the form of phrases and dependent clauses. There are 4 basic variations of the subordinating sentence, depending on the relative positions of the main clause and the subordinate constructions. 1. Loose structure. The main clause comes first and is followed by the subordinate clauses and phrases. Periodic structure. The subordinate constructions precede the main clause, which closes the sentence. Convoluted structure. The main clause is split in 2, opening and closing the sentence. The subordinate constructions intrude between the parts of the main clause. Centered structure. The main clause occupies the middle of the sentence, and is both preceded and followed by subordinate constructions. The 4 patterns may be mixed in varying degrees, and frequently are. Even so, It is probably true that most subordinate sentences follow one pattern or another. The loose sentence. At its simplest, the loose sentence contains the main clause plus a subordinate construction. We must always be wary of conclusions drawn from the ways of the social insects, since their evolutionary track lies so far from ours. Robert Ardrey. The number of ideas in loose sentences is easily increased by adding phrases and clauses, related either to the main constructions or to a preceding subordinate one. I found a large hall, obviously a former garage, dimly lit, and packed with carts. Eric Hoffer. I knew I had found a friend in the woman, who herself was a lonely soul, never having known the love of man or child. Emma Goldman. As the number of subordinate constructions increases, the loose sentence approaches the cumulative style discussed on pages 124–125. It is impossible to draw a line between loose and cumulative sentences. Indeed, cumulative sentences, or rather, most of them, are a special variety of the loose style. The difference is relative, depending on the length and weight of the subordinate constructions. In the cumulative sentence, these take over, becoming more significant than the main clause, which serves primarily to introduce them. The following passage describing a Welsh town illustrates how loose structure evolves into a cumulative style. Llanbelythian hangs pleasantly, with its white cottages, and orchard and other trees, on the western slope of a green hill, looking far and wide over green meadows, and little or bigger hills, in the pleasant plain of Glamorgan, a short mile to the south of Cowbridge, to which smart little town, it is properly a kind of suburb. Thomas Carlyle. Loose sentences are appropriate for writing that aims to be colloquial, informal, relaxed. It puts first things first, as most of us do when we talk. On the other hand, loose structure lacks emphasis and easily becomes formless. Its unity derives not so much from a structural principle as from the coherence of thought. A loose sentence is well formed to the degree that it expresses the completed idea, or perception. A good example is the following passage, which begins a description of the Brooklyn home belonging to the writer's grandmother. Her house was a narrow brownstone, 2 windows to every floor except the ground, where the place of one window was taken by a double door of solid walnut plated with layers of dust-parked cheap enamel. Its shallow stoop. William Alfred. Alfred's sentence is unified by what it describes the facade of the house. When that perception ends and our eyes are turned upon the stoop, the writer wisely begins a new sentence. Of course, this question of when to stop, of knowing when one statement should end and another begin, applies to all kinds of sentences. But it causes special problems with loose structure, where the absence of a clear stopping place may tempt you to ramble on and on. The periodic sentence. Periodic sentences reverse the pattern of loose structure, beginning with subordinate constructions and putting the main clauses at the end. If there is no future for the black ghetto, the future of all Negroes is diminished. Stanley Sanders. Given a moist planet with methane, formaldehyde, ammonia, and some usable minerals, all of which abound, exposed to lightning or ultraviolet radiation at the right temperature, life might start almost anywhere. Lewis Thomas. There is no one formula for the periodic sentence. Often, however, the opening subordinate constructions are adverbial clauses, as in the example by Stanley Sanders, or participial phrases, as in that by Lewis Thomas. Whatever kinds of subordination it uses, the periodic style is emphatic. Delaying the principal thought increases its importance. To the degree that more and more subordinate clauses and phrases are accumulated at the beginning, further postponing the main clause, the sense of climax increases within limits, of course. Too long a delay will cause confusion. Here is an instance of effectively postponing the main point. Paralyzed by the neurotic lassitude engendered by meeting one's past at every turn, around every corner, inside every cupboard, I go aimlessly from room to room. Joan Didion. The periodic style is also more formal and literary than the loose, suggesting a writer at a desk rather than a speaker in a relaxed social setting, a tone advantageous on formal arca-signs, though less so when informality is desired. The convoluted sentence. In this type of periodic structure, the subordinate elements split the main clause from the inside, often intruding between the subject and the verb and sometimes between verb and object or within the verb phrase. White men, at the bottom of their hearts, know this. James Baldwin. And once in a spasm of reflex chauvinism, she called Queen Victoria, whom she rather admired, a goddamned old water dog. William Alfred. Convoluted structure, as an occasional rather than habitual style, is a good way of achieving variety in sentence movement. It also establishes strong emphasis, by throwing weight upon the words before and after the commas or dashes, setting off the interrupting constructions. Now demons, whatever else they may be, are full of interest. Here both demons and full of interest draw attention, expressing the principal idea more strongly than would loose or periodic structure. Now demons are full of interest, whatever else they may be. Whatever else they may be, demons are full of interest. However, this fact does not mean that the convoluted style is inherently better than either the periodic or the loose. It is simply a convenient way of establishing emphasis on particular words when that emphasis is desirable. On the other hand, convoluted structure is formal, and it can tax readers' attention, especially as the interrupting elements grow longer and more complicated. Even the humble ambition, which long cherished, of making sketches of those places which interested me, from a defect of eye or of hand, was totally ineffectual. Sir Walter Scott. The life story to be told of any creative worker is, therefore, by its very nature, by its diversion of purpose, and its qualified success, by its grotesque transitions from sublimation to base necessity, and its pervasive stress towards flight, a comedy. H. C. Wells. These are good sentences, carefully articulated and precise, but they are not easy to read. They demand attention. Readers must recognize when a construction is suspended and when it is resumed and be able to put the pieces together. Used sparingly, the long convoluted sentence has the virtue of the unusual. It draws attention to itself and, more important, to what it says, and it can challenge and stimulate the reader. A steady diet of such challenges, however, very soon grows tiresome. The centered sentence. The type of subordinate structure that places the main clause, more or less in the middle of the sentence, with subordinate elements on either side, has no common name. It has been called circuitous, and round composition, we shall say centered. Whatever we call it, we see it often. In the three examples that follow in this section, the main clauses have been italicized. Having wanted to walk on the sea like Saint Peter, he had taken an involuntary bath, losing his mitre and the better part of his reputation. Lawrence Durrell. Standing on the summit of the tower that crowned his church, wings upspread, sword lifted, the devil crawling beneath, and the cock, symbol of eternal vigilance, perched on his mailed foot, Saint Michael held a place of his own in heaven and on earth, which seems, in the 11th century, to leave hardly room for the Virgin of the Crypt at Chartres, still less for the Beau Christ of the 13th century at Amiens. Henry Adams. While not as emphatic as periodic or as informal as loose construction, the centered style has several advantages, especially in long sentences with numerous subordinate elements. It enables a writer to place those elements more clearly. If half a dozen or more phrases and dependent clauses all precede the main construction as in the periodic style, or all follow it as in the loose, some may seem to float free. The link becomes obscure, especially when writing about ideas. The chance of obscurity is reduced if the main clause can be placed in the middle of the subordinate elements. Another advantage of the centered sentence is that it is easier to arrange sentence elements to reflect the natural order of the event, or the ideas. Jonathan Swift does exactly this in the following passage, criticizing England's participation in the War of the Spanish Succession 1701–1714. After 10 years fighting to little purpose, after the loss of above 100,000 men, and a debt remaining of 20 millions, we at length hearkened to the terms of peace, which was concluded with great advantage to the Empire and to Holland, but none at all to us, and clogged soon after with the famous Treaty of Partition. Allowed a broad and uncritical meaning of idea, we may say that Swift's sentence contains 9 of them: 1. The 10 years fighting; 2. The little purpose, or lack of result; 3. The loss of the men; 4. The debt remaining; 5. The hearkening to peace; 6. The conclusion of the peace; 7. The advantages that followed for England's allies; 8. The absence of such advantages for England herself; and 9. The clogging of the peace. Here the order of the sentence mirrors events. In reality, as in the sentence, the fighting comes first, then the absence of positive results, the loss of life, the debt, and so on. Effecting a workable compromise between the natural order of thought, or of events on the one hand, and the grammatical order of the sentence, on the other, is one of the most difficult tasks a writer faces. When you are dealing with a long and complicated subject, the centered sentence may prove the easiest solution to the problem. The fragment. A fragment is a single word, a phrase, or a dependent clause standing alone as a sentence. It is considered fragmentary rather than a grammatical sentence, because it is not grammatically independent, and may not contain a subject and a finite verb. In formal writing, fragments are generally a fault, though occasionally valuable for emphasis or variety. Before looking at examples of such positive fragments, we need to understand the common forms that fragments may take and how, when they are a fault rather than a virtue, they may be corrected. As an instance of a single word fragment, consider this answer to a question. Do you understand? Perfectly. If we were to see the word perfectly printed all by itself, we should be puzzled. We know what the word means, but completely isolated it makes no sense. It is not grammatically meaningful. Of course, we rarely encounter words in such utter isolation. Usually they occur in the context of other words, or of clarifying social situations, and we can easily supply what is needed to complete the meaning. I understand perfectly. Fragments in composition are less likely to be single words than phrases or clauses, usually modifiers detached from the words they modify. Three very common cases are the participial phrase, the adjectival clause, and the adverbial clause. Each is italicized in the examples below. Detached participle phrase, I saw her going down street. Detached adjectival clause, everyone left except John, who decided to stay. Detached adverbial clause, it was very late when the party broke up. Awkward fragments such as these can be fixed in one of two ways. Either the fragment may be made part of the sentence where it acts as a modifier. I saw her going down the street. Everyone left except John, who decided to stay. It was very late when the party broke up. Or, the fragment may be kept as a separate statement, but made grammatically complete, either by removing the word or words, which render it subordinate, or by supplying, if necessary, a subject and verb. I saw her. She was going down the street. Everyone left except John. He decided to stay. It was very late. The party broke up. Though these alternative corrections result in grammatical sentences, they have slight differences in meaning. Slight differences in meaning are often the difference between good and mediocre writing. Turning the fragment into a complete sentence gives it more emphasis. A final type of fragment is the verbless statement. All people, whether they live in the city or the country. Here modifiers surround a noun people. But this noun, presumably the intended subject of a sentence, has no verb. The writer never predicates anything about people. Cases like this may require more extensive revision. Sometimes, if the noun is followed by a modifying clause, the verb of the clause may be adapted as the main verb. All people live in the city or the country. In this instance, the correction is too simple-minded to be what the writer intended. He or she needs to think out the idea, and supply an appropriate predication, perhaps something like, all people, whether they live in the city or the country, want the conveniences of modern life. Effective fragments. Fragments are very likely to be awkward and unclear when they are unintended, the result of carelessness or uncertainty about what a grammatical sentence is. but used skillfully, they are eye-catching, unusual, and emphatic. Many a man, said Spear, has been haunted by the nightmare that one day nations might be dominated by technical means. That nightmare was almost realized in Hitler's totalitarian system. Almost, but not quite. Aldous Huxley. Sweeping criticism of this type, like much other criticism, throws less light on the subject than on the critic himself. A light not always impressive. F. L. Lucas. Obviously, the effectiveness of fragments like these depends upon their being uncommon. It is best, then, to employ fragments very occasionally in formal composition, and only when you wish to draw attention to the idea they express. For practice. Which of the following statements are fragments? Revise them in two ways. First, by turning the fragment into a grammatically complete sentence in its own right, and second, by incorporating it into a sentence within which it serves as a modifier. 1. In the morning when the sun came up, the party broke camp. Most people are honest. Making an effort, for example, to find the owner of a wallet they picked up on a busy street. That girl is very nice. The one you introduced me to. School is not so difficult. If you don't let your work pile up. Not everyone likes football. My brother, for instance. Older people who lived through the Depression and the Second World War and experience great changes in our society. The boy climbing the tree. That's my cousin. Although he wasn't at fault. Everybody blamed him. That man running down the street. He stole this lady's purse.